I'm going to be looking specifically at, or I'm going to be exploring, just touching on a few issues related to ethics and communication in research processes. I'm not going to be going into a long lecture. I'm going to be just focusing on a few key questions and issues which perhaps you would like to think about when you begin to engage in these sites. I'm going to take the kind of social sciences view of this. I'm going to be looking at issues that researchers in the social sciences think about when they're doing research. And I'm going to problematize the idea of ethics. Okay? Right, so I think the one thing we need to, or I think that we need to think about, is that whenever you're making a decision, there are ethics involved. All right? For me, ethics is essentially about decision making. So when you're choosing a site, when you're choosing a particular person to speak to in an area, when you're coming up with a design intervention, whether you're choosing to do a PowerPoint or a handout, whether you're going to do it in a lecture venue or sit outside, or these are ethical decisions. All right, so we're making ethical decisions all the time. And ethics is important for research and it's important for academia. But I'm concerned that there's a tendency to subscribe to what I call normative definitions of ethics. In other words, it becomes a kind of tick box exercise rather than being something that's intrinsic to the work that researchers do. So although issues such as choice, dignity, transparency, and consent are important issues in the research process, it may be argued that ethics is actually central to the work that researchers do. It's not just a bureaucratic institutional process of covering all your bases. Okay? So one of the things that you need to think about when you go into the field is that you're going to have to get consent from the participants to be involved in your project, but you also need to think on a much, I think, deeper and philosophical level around the ethics that you are engaging in your project. And these are related to the research approach that a group decides to undertake when engaging in the community. Now, there are lots of different research approaches and different research paradigms, but ones that come to mind for this particular project are participant observation, which is a form of ethnography, where you're in a field and you're closely involved with your research participants, but you develop close relationships with them in order to understand their context. You have action research, where you work with research participants to develop knowledge, to solve problems specific to the participant's context. All right? So the findings of the research are not just about journals and conferences, they're about solving problems for particular contexts. That's action research. And then we have participatory action research, where the participants are actually co-researchers in the process of research. So the participant is a researcher that works with them. All right, so these are different models and different approaches, and how you choose them says something about the ethics in your particular project. One thing that comes up again and again in research processes is power relationships. All right, so I think that for me, a critical researcher is asking constantly, what are the power relationships that are emerging when I'm working in a particular field? You've got to keep in mind that when you enter into a research process, there are people there who already have entitlements, roles, assets, capital, resources, beliefs, cultures that are pre-existing, all right, and that are part of the context, and they shape the way that people engage with you. But at the same time, the research process generates entitlements, roles, assets, expectations, assumptions, and so on. So in process of inquiry, people enter into relationships that can be prescribed and unconscious. All right? So for example, a reflective researcher is able to identify the extent to which the research situation in itself creates power. All right? So in the research situation, who is granted the capacity for action? Who is acted upon? Who can generate knowledge? Who can't? Who is allowed to represent knowledge and who can't? Where is that knowledge being represented? What roles are active? What roles are passive? How is labor divided when people are engaging in inquiries? These are important questions. All right. So for me, when you're in the field, how the power dynamics emerge are really, really important. And it's something that a critical researcher would reflect upon in the practice. So if you consider, for example, in a census, a data collector arrives at a homeowner's front door, knocks and asks for an interview, immediately that creates a certain kind of relationship between one human being and another. The question is, how are you going to negotiate that relationship when you're in a community site? What relationship do you want with your participants? Are your research subjects going to be called subjects or participants or collaborators or partners? What are the terms of the relationships that you're working on in the site? Framing is very important for me in the research process. And for me, often what happens in a research project is that there's certain givens that are invisible in a project. So, for example, you often find in research reports the funding, the reports about the funding and the effect that had on the research is absent. Or marketing issues could come up, funding expectations, assessment, political issues. So what motives are brought to a research project becomes really, really important. What are the assumptions that are at work in a particular research project? So, for example, we often assume a common research frame is that research is objective and unrelated to moral or political questions. Do scholars and academics have a responsibility to take action, or are they objective and passive bystanders? These are frames that are already operative in a research situation. So these need to be questioned. Social justice is something that's becoming increasingly important for a lot of researchers in the social sciences. But that needn't be taken as being synonymous with ethical considerations in research. Conventionally, ethical thinking entails not just engaging in social justice, but asking questions, critical questions about the nature of justice, the nature of ethics. What is human well-being? What is happiness? What obligations do we have? What is freedom? What is equality? What is choice? So research becomes, for me, a critical researcher is constantly asking questions about the definitions that they're working with in their practice. Okay, so if you believe in social justice, what do you mean by justice? Whose justice are you talking about? How do you define it? Okay. So yesterday, for example, there were quite challenging things that you may have seen. How are you going to understand what you saw? What assumptions do you have when you look at a particular scene? What assumptions do you bring to bear in the way that you're looking at a particular situation? One of the things you're challenged to do in this project is to develop a design intervention. And in research, you have this common trope called the research problem. And in design, we have this idea of the research problem. Okay? And I think it's a very important concept, but again, it's something that needs to be interrogated. Because we need to ask questions like, whose reality is being represented in the problem? Who's seeing something as a problem, and why are they seeing it from that point of view? What realities are being left out in the definition of the problem? In defining the problem, there's classification and definitional struggles at work in the statement of the problem. So, for example, you might say in studying xenophobia, what frame do we bring to bear in understanding that phenomenon? Do we bring an economic frame, a political frame, a historical, cultural? Is causation the right way to think about xenophobia? So there's a lot of, to simply jump to a research problem, to say this is the research problem, or this is the design problem, without thinking through the issues is really important. One of the key things for me in this project is looking at the idea of a research problem quite deeply, all right, and in a way that's not superficial. Okay, so for example, if you have to look at something like water pollution, the cause of water. What is the cause of a water pollution problem? Okay, is it a technical problem? Is the proximity of the community to the river a problem? Is it a planning problem? Is it an economic problem? Because it's linked to a whole range of other issues. Is it a political problem? Because of perhaps corruption? So, there's a lot of the nature of the problem says a whole lot about the ethics of your project, how you define your problem. So I think that's really key. And further to that, the research purpose. Whose interests are being served in the purpose of the research project, or the purpose of the design project? So the purpose of this study, or purpose of this project is to, and normally we ask students to complete the sentence. But we need to interrogate those verbs that are at work in the purpose statement. So if we say the purpose of this study is to solve, that means we're prioritizing instrumental problems. If we say revisit, it's a reflective problem. If we say redefine, it's an abstract purpose. If we say improve, it's a concrete purpose. If we say expose or objectifying, challenge, what is the purpose of the design intervention? What is the purpose of your project? Why have you chosen that particular verb for your research problem? So one of the things that the project asks of you is to not necessarily assume, for me this is what the project asks you to do, is not necessarily assume that the solutions that you're generating are necessarily the only way to do things, that there are alternatives, and that there are multiple voices and histories and ways of looking at a particular context in generating a problem, in generating a purpose. So dialogue becomes an important aspect of this project, the nature of the dialogue that takes place over the 2 to 3 week project. Okay? What kinds of interactions do you want your group to engage in? Within the group? Within the community? What is the ethic, the ethics in the dialogue that's taking place? And within that, you need to ask certain questions. Where are the findings of our project published? In what forms are the public findings published? Whose voice is going to be predominant in the publishing of our findings? Whose interests are at stake in this project? And perhaps most importantly is, what position does the designer researcher take in relation to these questions? So you are, in essence, creating a position for yourself as a designer in this project. You might see the designer as an expert, you might see the designer as a political figure, you might see them as a spokesperson, someone in solidarity, as a partner. How are you going to, how do you position yourself as a designer when it comes to community issues? Okay, so I'm going to leave it at that. Thank you very much.